Hi, I'm Heather Benning, and my show at Swift Current is called A Prairie Gothic, Let Our Fields Be Broader, But Our Nights So Much Darker.
Those boys could be in marble, the way they're sitting there, and yet, so they're weeds.
I also get a sense of like a Roman Colosseum.
It almost made me think of the boys like watching the girls to pick their wife.
I don't necessarily get it right off, but I still enjoy it.
Art Gallery of Swift Current is pleased to be presenting the exhibition A Prairie Gothic, Let Our Fields Be Broader, But Our Nights So Much Darker. This exhibition is by Saskatchewan artist Heather Benning, and the show was produced through a partnership of the Moose Jaw Museum and Art Gallery and Art Gallery of Swift Current.
She's a real rising star in the Canadian art world. When you bring a collection of work together that's sort of driven by the same intentions, and the story just becomes stronger.
I grew up on a farm near Humboldt, Saskatchewan, and my dad had an old barn that he had turned into a mechanical shop. And then there was a hayloft up there that he basically gave to me to use as my space. My mom bought me a Canadian art magazine when I was 15, and which was quite exciting because all of a sudden I saw people who I was like, oh, they must be making a living. They're in a magazine. That's not really the case most of the time anyway. But yeah, and then I took a year off between high school and university. And then when I finally went to university, I pursued fine arts.
Heather finished her bachelor's degree at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, and then brought that back to Saskatchewan, where she really threw herself into a professional practice. She worked as an artist in residence and developed one of her more famous pieces known as the Dollhouse, which was a work that continued for a full 8-year period.
We used the life-size abandoned farmhouse that I had created a life-size dollhouse with. And the house stood for 7 years as a life-size dollhouse, where the interior was restored to the 1960s when the house was abandoned, but the exterior was left abandoned. We documented the house for a couple days before the fire, and then we did the fire and documented the fire.
And then jump back to the wall.
When you watch the film in its entirety, it starts out, there's more shots of the house in existence 7 years after it was restored. And then as the film goes on, little clips of fire, like little 1-second clips of fire, sneak into the film. And then eventually the fire consumes the house. And then we did a rollback at the end where the house sort of reemerges out of the flames. Is the fire the nightmare? Is the house, the little house on the prairies, just the daydream? I didn't want it to end with just this big fire.
She then was offered and worked in residence for a number of other projects, and then was able to move to Edinburgh, Scotland to do graduate work at the Edinburgh School of Art and Design. The observations that she made, the evaluations that she made there informed the work that she would do when she returned to Saskatchewan.
I was listening to a book on tape while I was driving to Ontario, so I was listening to Walking by Thoreau. There was this line that I kind of ripped off, but it comes from Let Our Fields Be Broader, But Our Nights So Much Darker. He was talking about the untouched land, and then we came and stirred it all up, filled it with people, and then now the people are all dispersed again. So from that area, and how it's now empty again. Empty, but like drastically changed as well, and not necessarily for the better. I started building the sarcophagi first, but they were kind of a hard sell because they were like life-size sculptures of my parents at rest. A curator came to visit me, Amy Fung, and she saw some work in my sketchbook, and she decided that she wanted me to make the altar. Like, she just saw the drawing of it. So I shelved the sarcophagi, moved into the altar project, and then there's also the project Work Hard, Be Nice. That's 3 large sculptural works that I knew eventually I would want all in one show, because it was all under one sort of theme about like prairie people and farming, and sort of a little bit of local history and lore to it. So lore and gore is what Tim calls it.
The piece here is called The Altar, and it's a piece that Heather Benning created that's based on medieval altar pieces. And so here you have her depicting a different scene in almost like separate cells.
So the story that's unfolding is actually a story that was told to me by a friend of mine while I was working on the Dollhouse project, and it's about her, one of her great aunts. And she had married a man from a neighboring town, and things didn't go well somehow in the marriage. At some point, she left him. The fellow, he decided to go to her house sometime in the evening. He lit the farmhouse on fire, and then he waited for them to evacuate the house, and then he chased her down and apparently chopped her head off on the road. Normally in an altar, the center is kind of left for the saint who has been martyred and has now found her glory or his glory and is now in peace and in heaven. I wanted to kind of explain that, or not just blame him because it's his story. There's something that's happened to him in his life that caused him to react and live the life he chose to live and take the life that he took. So I wanted them to kind of, have equal significance and equal play in the story. This portion of the show is called Work Hard, Be Nice, and I created it while I was an artist in residence for the University of Regina. I sculpted the little girls first, and I did them out of clay, and then I started casting them in multiples, and while I was casting them, I had the molds on the wall, so I would use the runoffs from my extra plastic to make the smaller pieces that were on the wall. And then I started sculpting the little boy while I was casting the girls, and then eventually finished the boy and started casting them as well. He's put up on a pedestal and he's kind of above what's happening beneath, and it's this idea that because he will eventually become a young man and then an older man, there's a notion of ability and success behind him from a very young age. On the base or on the floor we have 29 girls that are all cast from the same mold, but then they're all individually hand-painted. They're in a large grouping, but none of them are interacting with each other. And I wanted them to specifically not be interacting with each other, but more interacting in their own mind or in their own space. They're also dressed more in a sort of a 50s clothing or like a schoolgirl's clothing from the 50s, because I am talking about gender politics, which is still happening today and still going on very much so today. But we're a lot more comfortable about talking about it in the past tense rather than talking about it in the current tense. There has been great changes, but there hasn't been significant change for the lives of young girls versus the lives of young boys. This is a life-size sarcophagus, and it is modeled after my father, who at the time was still farming. And I wanted to make something like this where I would be able to elevate the working man into that idea of nobility, and that he and her, because there's a woman as well, that they were like kings of their own kingdom. And so I'm talking kind of about farm labor and the life of a farmer being their own kings and queens. There's a series of relief sculptures, and so there's one of Larry as a young boy, then Larry as a young man, and then my mother's work, or Rosalie's work, is her as a little girl in the living room, and then her as a young woman in her kitchen as an adult. Originally, when I was working on this project, I didn't want it to be about them, but then as I was working on it, it became more and more obvious that it had to be about them. It was about them. It's about stories that they had told me, growing up. So I eventually became more comfortable with it being about my actual physical parents, not just about anybody's parents or anybody's farming family. They were going to be the last of our family to be farming. I wasn't going to take over, nor my brother or sister. So it's kind of about the death of that sort of situation, or that personal situation. It's more just reflecting back what is happening and a bit of a goodbye. All of these houses raised families, and then we just have these remnants left, these skeletons in our past that we can look upon every once in a while and be nostalgic about it as though it was this better type of life, but it really wasn't. I mean, there's a reason why the houses are empty, and there's a reason why nobody could take them over.
If you have program ideas that you'd like to see on Max TV Local On Demand, write us at max.local@sasktel.com.